As the second year of fighting in Ukraine draws to a close, a number of the U.S.'s NATO allies in Europe are raising doubts about the likelihood of success. This was Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán speaking in Zurich, Switzerland, in late November of this past year.
What was the strategy of the West in that war? I simplify a little bit, but this is the fact. Our strategy was that the Ukrainians will fight and will win on the front line. The Russians will lose on the front line. And that lose will create a change in Moscow. There will be a new leadership, and we can negotiate. Putin is a world crimer, crime maker, whatever. And the new leadership will be acceptable as partner for negotiation to the European Union. That was the strategy. We finance, the Ukrainians fight and die. Where we are now, it's obvious that the Ukrainians will not win on the front line. There is no solution on the battleground. Russians will not lose. There will be no political change in Moscow. This is the reality.
Orbán was not the only member of NATO who's skeptical about U.S. predictions of a victory over Russia. This was the new Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, speaking 3 weeks earlier.
I was not surprised at all when I saw that Zelensky's video message at the meeting of the European Council was met without any interest. Times are really changing. Until recently, he was greeted everywhere with applause, and now he's not allowed to speak in some chambers of the highest legislative bodies, as it was recently in the United States. At the EU session to discuss Ukraine, I felt terribly tired. It is true that Ukraine is corrupt at all levels, as former European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker said. But talking about it publicly is considered politically incorrect. It is true that Ukraine's autumn counteroffensive failed. But again, it is politically incorrect to say this. The EU blindly copies the policy of the Biden administration, and instead of offering some solutions, continues to give Kyiv money and weapons. But it is to no avail. The war has reached a dead end.
Apparently, the U.S. hasn't reached that conclusion yet. This was the Deputy Permanent Representative of the United States to the United Nations, Robert Wood, speaking this past Saturday at a UN Security Council meeting.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Assistant Secretary Chiari, for your briefing yet again today. Colleagues, we are once again gathered in this chamber to discuss the impacts of Putin's illegal, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And as I said yesterday, the United States mourns each and every civilian life lost to this conflict and all conflicts worldwide. We mourn every Ukrainian life cut short by Russian aggression. And we have not lost sight of the fact that ordinary Russian civilians are also bearing the brunt of the Kremlin's brutal war. Just as we discuss issues openly and plainly in this chamber, Putin should be honest with his own people about the true and mounting cost of this war. This cost is not only the hundreds of thousands of lives lost on the battlefield, the families torn apart, and the many who have fled the country, but also the bleaker economic future for those who remain. One fact remains clear. We are here again today because the Kremlin refuses to halt its illegal invasion. Every day, the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine continues. Putin is responsible for the senseless and unnecessary loss of life. This is his war. It is his war of choice, and one that seeks to seize the sovereign territory of another UN member state and subjugate the people of Ukraine to his will. As my colleagues have noted, Russia could end this war today and prevent more civilian deaths. The Russian delegation should beseech their capital for action, not this council. As long as Russia persists, the United States will support Ukraine's effort to defend itself, in line with Article 51 of the UN Charter and consistent with its obligations under international humanitarian law. Civilians are protected under the law of war, and we call for the protection of all civilians on all sides of every conflict. All parties to a conflict must take feasible precautions to minimize civilian harm. Mr. President, Russia alone is responsible for starting and prolonging this war in violation of the UN Charter and for the resulting loss of life. We again call on Russia to end its aggression and withdraw its troops from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders immediately.
February 22nd will mark the second anniversary of the beginning of a military operation by Russia in Ukraine intended to stop the Kiev government, which was installed by a U.S.-backed coup in 2014, from continuing to shell and otherwise attack civilian populations in the eastern part of Ukraine, where mostly ethnic Russians reside. So far, the U.S. has spent more than $200 billion of its own funds and seen another $150 billion of its allies' funds go to Ukraine. Ukraine's military has been devastated by the war, and the U.S. says it sees no end in sight. For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.